My family is originally from Belgium, and this is my late grandfather's story, which took place during the height of World War II. I will be writing it from his perspective as it was told to me. I was 11 years old when the Nazis invaded the small town we lived in near the German border. A year before the invasion, we heard whispers about the Germans coming our way after the fall of Poland, but our people refused to flee their homes. From late 1939 to early 1940, we would constantly see the Belgian military passing through, making their way to the nearby border. We had faith in our leaders, and with the constant presence of our military, we felt secure. But we were wrong. In early May of 1940, the Germans broke through the defensive lines and began their blitzkrieg of Belgium. It was only mere hours before Nazi tanks were moving through our streets. The soldiers started rounding up citizens, asking if any of them were Jewish. My family and I were Catholics, so we were spared from the onslaught. However, I watched many of my friends and their families being loaded onto trucks and taken away. There was some resistance to the invaders, but that didn't last long. For 2 weeks, we stayed in our homes, listening to gunfire at night. We finally were allowed to resume our lives, but things were far from normal. I am grateful in some small ways because I've heard many horrific stories about how the Nazis treated people after they took over. However, the ones stationed in our town were not cruel to us all the time. I believe it was because most of us were half German, and our primary language was German. In fact, it became a crime to speak any other language. Since both of my parents were school teachers, I was already fluent in both German and Dutch at a young age. After my parents were done teaching the children for the day, they were forced to have extra classes to teach German to anyone living in the town who did not speak it. I would hardly ever see them during these times. 6 months after the invasion, there were reports of young women going missing every week. As you can imagine, we all knew the Nazis were responsible for the disappearances. There was one or more womanizers among their ranks, committing crimes with impunity because of the power they had over us. We had it better than most, but they were still Nazis. Even after the war, none of the disappearances were ever investigated. In the grand scheme of things, they were forgotten. One night, my parents were working late at the school, and I was left alone at our home. There was a curfew mandate that we had to follow, so I would either spend my time playing chess or drawing pictures. However, I decided to be daring this evening. Our house was located on the outskirts of town, and the nightly patrol rarely ever came through there. By this time it was winter, but I remember that the weather was fair that night. I wanted to take a short stroll into the woods behind our house for a while. It was something I used to do all the time before the war, so I grabbed my coat, left a lamp on by the front window, and exited the house from the back door. I made my way through the snow-covered trees for about an hour before I decided to start heading back. I then heard the faint sounds of muffled screaming and voices harshly whispering in German, though I couldn't understand what was being said. I stayed low and made my way toward the noise. I came to a massive pile of wood. The disturbance seemed to be on the other side of it, so I carefully peered around the debris and saw a most horrific sight. A woman was being held down against her will by 2 soldiers, while 2 Nazi officers were arguing with each other. One claimed that it was immoral for them to have their way with her, while the other argued that since she broke curfew, she was now considered a criminal, and they would do as they pleased with her. At this time, I didn't know what exactly they planned on doing with the young girl, but as I got older, things became more clear. I didn't want to get into trouble as well, so I backed away slowly, stepping on a twig in the process. The 4 men suddenly stopped talking, realizing that someone else was there with them. One of the officers ordered the soldiers to let the girl go and search the area. I quickly ducked behind some nearby bushes and watched as the frightened girl ran back toward town. I'm still not sure why they let her go. The only thing I was worried about at that moment was being found. The two soldiers came out from behind the pile of wood, brandishing rifles. By this time, the sun had begun to set, bathing the forest in an eerie half-light. The two men were closing in, and they would soon discover my hiding spot. I considered running for my life, but I knew I was not fast enough to outrun their bullets, so I decided to stay put and take my chances. Suddenly, a dark, towering silhouette emerged from the trees behind the soldiers. They spun around, but before they could aim their guns, the figure was upon them. One of the men was sent flying backward, where he met his death against a tree, while the other was suspended in midair, thrashing his arms and legs against the attacker. There came a sound of snapping bone, and the soldier fell limp. After the body fell to the ground, I got a good look at what had attacked the men. I couldn't make out certain details because of the poor lighting, but one thing I do remember is that it stood upright and had a pair of massive antlers on its head. I was in utter shock, too terrified to move a muscle. The thing then moved its head and looked directly at me. There then came a hoarse whisper. "Leave now." I covered my mouth to prevent myself from screaming, as urine made its way down my trousers. The officers, still behind the mound of wood, began to call out to their comrades, which snapped me out of my trance. I left the bushes and tore through the forest. As I ran, I could hear the screams of the two officers resounding through the trees. I didn't stop until I made it back home. I never told my parents about what I encountered in the forest. They would have switched my backside if they found out I broke curfew. After that night, there were more nightly patrols around my area, along with stricter curfews, and I never ventured into the forest after dark again. The Nazis were finally driven back by the Allied forces 4 years later, and Belgium was free again. The town held too many bad memories for us, so we eventually moved to the United States. Despite the traumatic experience of having our town occupied by the Third Reich, I will never forget that antlered creature I saw.
Hello, my name is John Smith III, and I'm 55 years old. This is my grandmother's story. I've taken some liberties to fill in the blanks based on historical documents and accounts that I've read. My grandmother, Laura, lived through the German occupation of Poland in World War II. Her family resided in the region of Poland that was once part of Germany before the war. This is important to keep in mind while listening. Let's return to early 1945. Laura would have been about 15 years old at the time, and at this point in the war, the Nazis had occupied the area for several years. My grandmother's village was mostly made up of ethnic Germans, so she didn't witness many instances of mistreatment from the soldiers. Since she and my great-grandmother were also German, their interactions with the Wehrmacht were mostly pleasant. But things would change on the night in question. For historical context, at this time during the war, the Germans were being pushed back by the Red Army, which had entered Poland. Of course, no one in the village was fully aware of the situation. There were only rumors. Laura's father, my great-grandfather, Garrett, had died of natural causes some years before, so it was just Laura and her mother living in the house. The Germans were aware of this, which is why I believed that they knocked on their door that night. Something else to keep in mind is that Laura was a bit rebellious at this age. She would often stay up past her bedtime and, on this night, was hiding in a hallway adjacent to the dining room, eavesdropping on the conversation. A group of German soldiers entered the house and sat at the dining room table. Her mother cooked them supper and served them drinks. While her mother was preparing the food, my grandmother returned to her bedroom because she knew that her mother would check on her as soon as she was done cooking. Laura's bedroom was in the hallway where she had been hiding, so as soon as her mother finished in the kitchen, she checked on her and then told the men that she was turning in for the night. Laura then quietly made her way back to the hallway and began to listen to the men still sitting in the dining room. "It was nice of her to make us dinner tonight. It was quite excellent."
Yes, it was pleasant to have a home-cooked meal for once. I grow tired of the rations they send us. I've spoken to many of the villagers here, and they have all complimented her cooking skills.
"So, you just decided to knock on her door tonight, hoping that she would offer..."
Of course not, Lieutenant. I ran into her earlier today and told her that we were ordered to conduct a search of this premises, but that I didn't think it would be necessary if she treated us to dinner.
"That's the captain for you, always calculating." The men chuckled in unison, and after some small talk, one of the soldiers asked the captain about what was happening on the Eastern Front. The atmosphere in the room seemed to become tense.
Well, if you want the honest answer, I believe the Fuhrer made a grave mistake by moving toward Russia, and we are now experiencing the consequences of that miscalculation.
"And why is that, Captain?"
You have all heard the stories about how the Russians fight, sending men into battle with no rifles, shooting anyone who tries to flee. Stalin is a tyrant, and he doesn't seem too concerned with how many of his countrymen are thrown into the slaughter. That may seem sloppy to you, and it certainly seemed that way to the high command as well, but I knew that eventually they would overwhelm us with their numbers. In fact, part of the reason I have all of you here tonight is to inform me that the Soviets have broken through our lines and are heading straight for Germany as we speak.
"But that means that they will be coming through here."
Yes, our scouts have reported that they are much closer than we thought. 24 hours, perhaps sooner. High Command wants to turn this place into a base of operations. The enemy cannot be allowed to penetrate the German borders.
"And what of the villagers, Captain?"
I'm afraid they will have to be euthanized.
"But they are Germans, like us."
We simply can't take any prisoners now, or go through the hassle of relocating them. One of our armored divisions will be here by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. They expect this village to be vacated by then. The rest of the battalion have been ordered to gather the villagers at midnight tonight.
"Captain, if I may ask, why are we just now finding out about this?"
I'm glad you asked, Lieutenant.
The captain took a long drag of his cigarette.
The four of you have never seen combat, and Lieutenant, I'll be frank, I know who your father is, and I know that your rank wasn't earned, it was granted to you. However, before the sun rises, all of you will understand the responsibilities that come with wearing that uniform.
A cold silence set in. The captain stood up from his chair.
Lieutenant, I want you to...
The captain was not able to finish his sentence as gunfire suddenly erupted from outside, and the front door of the house flew open. "Captain, the Russians are here! All men ordered to the front!" My grandmother was immediately grabbed from behind by her mother, who apparently was also listening to the conversation that was taking place in the dining room. But now all bets were off, as Russian troops were at the gates. Her mother led her into the cellar, and they both stayed there, listening to the sounds of gunfire and yelling until the morning. I wish that I could tell you that the Russians liberated them, but unfortunately, the truth isn't always so pleasant. Unlike the Germans, the Soviets had no mutual respect for the villagers and treated them cruelly. Many of the women were raped, and many of the men faced a firing squad. Even though they had nothing to do with the Third Reich, they were punished simply for being German. The next part is going to sound unbelievable, but fate often surprises us with miracles. My great-grandfather Garrett was a carpenter before he died and spent many years working in the Soviet Union during the 1930s, where he befriended a man who would eventually become a captain in the Red Army. They kept in contact for many years after Garrett returned to Poland. This man, Captain Alexander Sobolev, happened to be the one leading the Russian battalion. He chose this village in particular to see if he could find my great-grandfather after all these years. He was saddened to hear of his death. Captain Sobolev told my grandmother that her father had once made a rocking chair for his mother but refused to accept any form of payment. I believe that is what saved them from any harm from the Soviet soldiers under his command. While they had to watch many of their fellow villagers being brutalized, they were left alone. And after the war, my grandmother would come to America during the 1950s, where she met her husband, the original John Smith, and lived out the rest of her days in a small town in upstate New York. After hearing this story myself, I believe that the Nazi captain was going to have those 4 men kill both my great-grandmother and my grandmother Laura that night. He wanted them to earn their rank, but they were interrupted by the invading Russians. An unlikely connection my great-grandfather made years before is what saved them from any cruel treatment by the bloodthirsty Russians. With all of that in mind, I can't help but feel incredibly lucky to even exist, and I take a drive up to the cemetery every year to leave flowers at my grandmother's grave.
This is my grandmother's story. We'll call her Natalia. My family is originally from Russia. My grandmother relocated to the United States in the late 40s, shortly after World War II. This experience took place in the fall of 1941. Hitler had initiated Operation Barbarossa, which called for a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. I don't remember the name of my grandmother's village, but I know that it was only a few kilometers away from Leningrad, and most of the people who lived there worked at a lumber mill. If you were to read about many of the well-known battles of World War II, you would undoubtedly come across the Siege of Leningrad. I'm not a historian by any means, but from what I understand, the Nazis formed a blockade around the city, stopping all supply runs to both the Red Army and the citizens. What is often overlooked is that many of the small villages and towns on the way to Leningrad were crushed by the Germans with little to no resistance. When the war began, many of these small villages were kept in the dark about the German advance, and with my grandmother only being a child, there was a lot she didn't know. On one gloomy September morning, she was playing outside with some of the other neighborhood children when she heard her father shouting as he ran down the road.
"The Germans are coming! The Germans are coming! Run for your life!"
Almost as soon as her father was done shouting, a loud cracking sound cut through the air, and the house next to Natalia's was instantly destroyed. My grandmother remembered the wails of agony coming from the pile of rubble. Her neighbors, who were still inside the house, were now trapped beneath the collapsed structure. Chaos erupted in the small town as the villagers began to flee their homes. Natalia was scooped up by her parents, and they joined the rest of the panicked villagers. She remembered looking over her father's shoulder to see what she described as monsters on wheels, chasing after them, crushing houses beneath their tracks as they closed in. Unfortunately for the villagers, the settlement was located next to a massive gorge. There was one of those stereotypical wooden bridges held together by rope, which was the only way across. The bridge was deemed unsafe. It was only used by fishermen to reach the rivers on the other side. The villagers called it the Fisherman's Path. There were plans to build a new bridge, but nothing ever came of it, a decision that the villagers would come to regret now that the Nazis were at their backs, and their only hope for escape was to cross this decrepit bridge. The village was protected by Russian troops, but they had been completely outmatched by the Nazis, and also retreated to this bridge, presumably just before the attack on the village. When the crowd of frightened villagers gathered at the bridge's entrance, they had guns pointed at them by the soldiers. The commanding officer explained to them that if everyone began running across the bridge at once, it would surely collapse, and that only a handful of people could go at a time. However, with the sounds of German tanks drawing closer, the soldiers were not able to maintain order, and the villagers began pushing past them to get to the bridge. Gunfire erupted as the soldiers began firing on their own people. Natalia's mother, my great-grandmother, was tragically caught in the crossfire and died in front of her, gunned down by the very men who were supposed to protect her, Chaos erupted once again as the soldiers struggled to keep back the frightened villagers. My great-grandfather Dmitri was somehow able to avoid the gunfire and make his way past the blockade with Natalia in his arms. The officer ordered his men to shoot Dmitri, but when they saw he had a young child in his arms, none of them could bring themselves to carry out that order. My great-grandfather cried out,
Please take my daughter across the bridge. I will stay behind, but please take her. She's only a child. Please!
My young grandmother erupted into tears. The last thing she remembers is looking over the shoulder of the soldier who was carrying her across the bridge. She heard my great-grandfather Dmitri calling out to her one last time.
I love you, Natalia. Never forget your family. We will always be with you.
A loud crashing sound was heard before she lost consciousness. She woke up sometime later within the city of Leningrad. Much like her home village, the Nazis had surrounded the city, cutting off all communications and supplies. She stayed in a library that was converted into a shelter for citizens who had lost their homes. The soldier who rescued her would come and check on her from time to time and would bring her bread whenever he could. Over the next 2.5 years, the city was constantly bombed by the Germans, and the lack of rations led to mass starvation among the citizens. Despite all this, Leningrad was never completely taken over by the Nazis, and my grandmother survived. When she relocated to the United States, she eventually met my grandfather, and they started a family. She lived a good life until she passed away peacefully in 2003. Her memory inspires me every day. I couldn't imagine the horror of losing my parents and my home, and still having the will and determination to survive. Let us remember the men and women who fought bravely and died in World War II. I can only hope that if that same evil ever returns to threaten our world, that we can all set aside our differences and unite against it, once again. I will end this story by sharing a quote from Winston Churchill. It's not enough that we do our best. Sometimes, we have to do what is required. There's
always a reason to be afraid.